please join me in welcoming Deborah Rose.
Thank you, Jasmine. Let me start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of country here. I really can't imagine what it's like to have a modern city sit down on top of your country and learn to negotiate that. And I have the greatest admiration for the Aboriginal people here who've done that. I'd like to pay respects to their old people and their dreamings, which I believe are all still there under the ground. And I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Jasmine, who's a fantastic organizer. As Jasmine told you, I've been working with and learning from Aboriginal people for quite a long time, about 28 years now. And I've had the most glorious time running all around the outback of Australia under the guidance and protection of Aboriginal people, working on matters that to me, matters that were of grave significance to the Indigenous people because it concerned their land, their kids, their future, their language, their sacred sites, their everything that they really cared about. And in addition to my own passion to see justice for them, also was very exciting for me that as a descendant of settlers and dispossessors, to be able to be involved in unmaking some of that history of dispossession, unmaking some of that violence, has been a really privileged and beautiful part of my life. Well, a great deal of my learning has been about country. And one of the most interesting things about country is that there's no nature-culture divide. If you've been coming to these lectures, I'm sure you've been well inculcated in the whole Western thing of nature and culture as somehow separate kinds of, qualitatively different kinds of things. That we humans are separate from nature, we're special, we're above nature, nature's below us, nature exists for us, we are its masters, and whatever it is, we're not, whatever we are, it isn't. And many people today think that this is one of the major obstacles to changing the way we think and act as we try to meet the challenges of this anthropogenic event, this human-caused event that is now running away from us, and we don't know where it's taking us, but we know it's going to be bad, going to be tough. Well, in the nourishing terrains of Aboriginal Australia, there is no nature-culture division. In country, there is neither nature nor culture, there is life. There is life that goes coursing through the living beings and coursing through the earth itself, through the landscape, the landforms, the water, bubbling up in the springs, and so on. It's all life. It's all about life. Countrymen are groups of living beings who belong to a given region, and the term countryman refers to women and to men and to animals and to plants, to all of the living things that belong there. Countries and countrymen exist as a result of creation. The creation ancestors, often known as dreamings, were shapeshifters. They shifted back and forth from human form to animal form, back to human form, back to animal form. They shifted into plants or shifted back out. They were other things like the sun and the moon and the rainbow. We're going to hear more about the moon. And these ancestors instituted groups of descendants. The descendants of the kangaroo dreaming ancestor are, the descendants are the kangaroo people and the kangaroos. Okay, and the same with the goanna people and the goanna reptiles. The same with the echidna, same with all these different groups. You have these groups of countrymen that include the human and the not human, the other than human. So within kin groups, there's no nature-culture divide. There's difference. Everybody knows that a human walks on two legs and doesn't hop. A kangaroo, is not a human in that sense, but they're descended from this common ancestor. So there's relationship. People whose kin include animals and plants find that their families are in dreadful peril at this time because of extinction. we're deeply into the 6th great extinction event on Earth, and this is the first one that has been caused by a single species, namely us. Anthropogenic extinction, as it's called in conservation biology, is a fact of death. It's growing exponentially. In fact, we really don't know what the rate is, because species are dying out more rapidly than they can be documented. But as E.O. Wilson tells us in his book, The Future of Life, an unknown number of species is tipping into the thin zone from the critically endangered to the living dead, and thence into oblivion. Well, Australian extinctions, and no doubt many of those that are taking place elsewhere, affect animal and plant species that are situated within a culture of knowing, a culture of kinship. This is not to say that people who understand themselves to be in kin relations with other species are incapable of contributing to the disasters around them. There are plenty of examples of people who do actually contribute to disasters wittingly or unwittingly. But losing kin is not the same as losing the abstraction known as a species. And many of the people I've spoken with are really clear about this. I'll quote a Ngiyambaa man from out at Burke, Paul Gordon, who said, "Some animals can't just be classed as fauna. Paddy melon is my mob. They're my people, my relations." And he was talking in the context of national parks and wildlife service, who have the job of protecting endangered species and have programs in place to protect paddy melons. And Paul Gordon was pissed off. He said, if national parks has something going with paddy melons, they should talk to us. It's our family. So I've been learning from people for whom extinctions are up close and very personal. And now I'm writing a book about extinctions. And that's the aspect of Indigenous knowledge that I want to talk about tonight. Specifically, I'm thinking about something that Heidegger once said about the differences between humans and animals. And animals, he claimed, don't lead lives of real consequence because they're not self-reflective. And because they're not self-reflective, their lives are mere lives. And because their lives are mere lives, their deaths are mere deaths. He obviously didn't know animals very well, and he wasn't speaking out of a position of having asked animals what they thought about this. He was doing this logically, but that was the logic, and it was another way of confirming a kind of boundary that's been very precious to the West for millennia. But from the point of view of Aboriginal kinship, there are no mere lives, and there are no mere deaths. As Paul Gordon said, they're not just fauna, they're family. So in my talk tonight, I'm going to be using, this is a rather long introduction, but I want to lay out some conceptual framework to lead you into a story that's kind of complex and perhaps a bit unexpected, and perhaps will work better if we've sort of done a little bit of groundwork in advance. But I'm going to be using what I think of as the Firestick Method of knowledge. And in the Firestick Method, you take a couple of big stories or big ideas and you rub them together. You hope that they'll be a bit abrasive because you really want to get some sparks going and you want to see what's going to happen. So it really is a sort of dialogical, open way of pursuing knowledge where you really try to be sure that you don't know what's going to happen. It's sort of like the opposite of what you would do if you were writing a grant proposal. You look for patterns and similarities and differences, and you ask questions. And in my case, I'm asking how some of the West's great stories would go if animals were there as part of the family. What would it do to our stories to bring in animals as family members? In other words, knowing a bit about Indigenous kinship with animals and thinking about some of our own stories from that point of view, what different ideas might emerge. And I'm doing this because ultimately extinctions matter to all of us. Animals, plants, watercourses, humans, all of us. Those of us who don't think of animals and plants as kin may have difficulty grasping this. And I want to spark up our ability to respond emotionally and empathetically and spiritually to the crisis we're in. It does concern us. And I enjoy paraphrasing Tolstoy in this regard. And so I say, you may not be interested in extinction, but extinction is interested in you. Okay, so let us now turn to two great stories The West story concerns Job, the man who was tormented by God. And the Indigenous story concerns the dingo who was tormented by the moon. And I'm going to bring them together around questions of death and questions of reaching out to others who are dying. This is actually a shortened version of a chapter in my book. An animal caught in the bright lights of the shooters does not run. It is stunned into a stillness just at the time before death guns it down. Suddenly there's a reverberating loneliness. No one wants to be inside that bright and deathful space. And there is a shattering silence. In this harsh light, we see for a moment just how quickly and callously death can be blasted into our world, how it can torture before killing by isolating and silencing, how it constructs a space in which a living being is suspended briefly between the world of joyful life and the long tumble into the abyss. The biblical book of Job gives us a vivid account of the poetics of this space between life and death. And more than any other thinker today, the Australian biblical scholar Norman Habel presses us to consider how God has spotlighted Job. As long as Job was held in God's scrutiny, he could not escape. God would not allow him to die, nor would he allow Job to live as a whole human being. God isolated Job several times over, singling him out for disaster. And starting when the Satan offered the wager that Job would no longer love God if God would destroy everything else that Job loved. And God took the wager and crushed Job. Then he withheld himself, denying dialogue. Furthermore, God denied Job any human comfort. Well, this man who sought to overcome God's silence, to press God into answering him, is both our kinsman and our death mate. His story impels us into a domain of anguish, and often there seems to be no way out. Well, I want to circle away from Job, leaving him spotlighted in the ruins of his life, but promising to return once we have explored a resonating story from Aboriginal Australia. So I want to invite you up into North Australia, into the Northern Territory, and out into the monsoonal savannas, to a little community called Yarralin, to sit around the campfire with a clever man named Old Tim and a few of the other old fellows who are yarning away about the perennial question, why do we have to die? Well, as I heard Old Tim, Yilngayari, Daly Bulgara, and other dingo lawmen tell the stories of the space between life and death, the moon was offering eternal life to the dingo. The stories are not meant to be 100% clear, as parts are held within a domain of secrecy. In summary, though, the moon's claim to fame is that he dies and returns as himself. Every month he disappears, and every month he comes back. And he's always the same moon. It's the one and the same, always coming back. So there's no death for the moon. There's a departure, but no death. There is, however, a terrible loneliness. The moon has no mates, no fellow creatures. There's only the one moon. So he offers dingo eternal life, but there's a catch. The dingo will have to become a sycophant of the moon, and the dingo refuses. And so the moon starts taunting him and daring him, urging him to die in return, to try to do as the moon does. Die, the moon says. Die as I do and come back again in 4 days' time. The dingo reckoned he couldn't do it, but the moon kept daring him, and so the dingo decided to take up the gamble. As Daly told the story, the dingo knew it wouldn't work, and his final words were, "You can't see me come out in 4 days, I'll go forever." And that's what happened. But unlike the moon, the dingo was not alone. His mates were there too, and they called out to him. "What's the good? Poor bugger," they called. "Come back, come back." And again they called, but he was truly gone. Well, people are related to dingoes, and as dingoes die, so we die. Quoting Daly again, "We follow that dog. We never did it differently." And sometimes he added, "Looks like we made a little bit of a mistake there." So there he was, the dreaming dingo, pressured into a contest he thought he would lose, and then abandoned by the moon who had persuaded him. Daly and others heap blame on the moon. Why that moon never go back and help him? Daly asked, clearly putting the case that the moon should have had some feeling for the dingo and helped him come back. That moon should have said, "Oh, that's bad. No good you stay dead like that. Why don't you come back again?" The moon didn't. The moon's triumph was a total win, but at the cost of connection with others. He goes away and returns, always himself, over and over again, never dying, but never sharing his life with others. He's eternal. His triumph is equally his loneliness, for he has no relationship with the world and all its contingent and glorious living things, with their passions, their desires, their songs, and their deaths.